So I'd like to welcome you to the Courageous Visioning webinar, where we're going to explore what it takes to really dare to change the world. And we will have all seen an awful lot coming across our inboxes in a variety of different ways over the past, well, many months and maybe longer, where there is that call to change our world in some shape or form. And we may find ourselves questioning what that's got to do with the world of business, what it's got to do with the world of organizations, and what it's got to do for all of us as leaders in the world at whatever level and in whatever capacity we are leaders. So we're going to hopefully provoke a few thoughts in those areas today. So you're all very welcome. I'm Lorraine Flower, and I'm part of an organizational development consultancy, leadership consultancy called Azure. We bring what we hope is a more conscious awareness to the practice of leadership and to the organizational world. And we seek to challenge and provoke a deeper understanding of the responsibilities of leadership, as well as the behaviors and practices that underpin that. And get people and teams at all levels, but particularly at the senior levels in organizations, to really think about what their function, what their purpose, what their contribution is, both to the organization, and increasingly further afield. So consciousness is a really important aspect of the work that we undertake, but also our place in the wider world. And so this webinar today is part of that offering to add some stimulus and add some new thinking, or at least bring that thinking into sharper focus for the next 45 minutes or so. So please, as I said, engage, use the chat, be prepared to speak if you want to by putting your hand up. You'll find the hands up function in the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So please do participate. So let's just think a little bit about where we are today as a humanity and as a world, as a planet. And I'm not going to give long, deep insights to this, but I really want to try and connect us all with some of the reality that we find ourselves facing in this current time. And we can always use hyperbole. We can always be, very grand about the things that are going on. But personally, I absolutely believe we're at a point in human history when we are facing fundamental choices about how we live our lives and how we connect with our planet. The place that in theory we should be calling home, certainly it is our home. Perhaps we don't treat it that way in all cases. And so there is a fairly fundamental choice that each of us as leaders has to think about and consider from the microscopic levels of our individual behaviors to the ongoing wider aspects in terms of our interactions with our communities, with our organizations that we work with our families and friends, literally at every level of our life. And if we think about this in a slightly sort of broad sense at this point, we know that humanity, we, the collective human beings on this planet, we are an incredible force. Perhaps we like to believe that more and more, but in many ways we are an incredible force. We've been evolving over many, many millennia. And I'm not a historian in the sense of facts and figures and dates, but if you cast your mind into the big picture of human evolution, we've had many attempts to take ourselves into a place where we have a more refined, a more connected, a more compassionate, more loving understanding of our role and our place here on this planet. And we failed in a number of ways and at many points in our long history. But as we've been evolving, bit by bit, we've been testing our faculties, our capabilities, physical, mental, emotional, hopefully even connecting increasingly on a spiritual level in a very conscious way. we are always connected spiritually, even if that's not our particular belief. So we've been testing, we've been pushing the boundaries, and that's been on every frontier. And we've tested through technology, through physical force, through intellectual capability. And we've really stepped heavily into that intellectual capability in the last few hundred years. And we've seen genius come through in so many different ways, in the understanding of science, of the atom, of electricity, of our overuse of fossil fuels, of artificial intelligence, of the next frontier of space and beyond. We have tested ourselves, we've accessed our intellect, and in many ways we might argue we've gone too far. We've gone too far, not because the intellect should not be tested and expanded and grown, and our mind needs to expand outwards and upwards, but because at the core of it, we've been far too focused on our own power and our own self-interest. And that self-interest as a humanity has brought us to the crisis we face now. It's a fundamental crossroads, as I said, and it is a decision point for us. Again, I'm not necessarily one who speaks to the Bible, but we're all very familiar with some of the aspects of the Bible where there's talk of, pestilence, fire, and flood. Well, we've seen and are seeing all of that, as we know. And bit by bit, as well as expanding our frontiers, we are also very much in danger of destroying ourselves. Our planet will continue regardless of us, of human beings. We are the temporary residents here. So we do need to find courage, and we need to be able to envision a new worldview that actually takes us to a place of harmony and cooperative living with our planet. So today I'm going to introduce a few inputs from various people and seek to bring those to some sort of thread of a story as we consider our responsibilities here as leaders, and particularly linking those into the organizational world and also to the capabilities that we need. I've included this quote here from Hazel Henderson. Hazel is a fellow of Findhorn. Findhorn is a spiritual community that is up in Scotland in the UK and has been operating for many years. You may have seen recent headlines about an arson attack, unfortunately, that has destroyed a number of its core buildings. Hazel is a fellow there, but she's also a futurist. And you're going to hear me use that phrase a little bit, and we'll explain a little bit more about that as we go on. But one of the functions of a futurist is that they engage themselves in what is called backcasting. So they actually try and project themselves and their thinking as far into the future as seems manageable and reasonable. And in this case, in an essay that Hazel produced at the beginning of this year, 2021, start of the new year, she cast out to 2050 and then narrated a pathway back. This quote here that really is seeking to remind ourselves of all that I've just said, that the planet is more than capable of looking after itself. It is a very powerful planet, and it doesn't need our interference, but it is very much a place where we have a role. We have a role to support the ongoing value and sacredness of the planet, as well as evolve as human beings over time and into higher levels of consciousness and connectivity with our world, with all aspects of our world, seen and unseen at this point. So we're being invited in to really connect with the biosphere of which we are a part, and to really connect with our own acute level of responsibility here. Her 2050 vision challenges some assumptions and ideologies that put humanity at the center of its own universe and demands from us a new vision that's fueled by a true understanding of our biosphere, a true connection with compassion for ourselves and all living things, and also a deeper sense of community. Now, I've extracted, it's not an overly long essay. You will find it relatively easily on the website, on the internet, but I've just extracted one very small piece as an example, really, of some of the things that Hazel is bringing forward. So as she's gone into the future and backcast, she's written this as a way of helping us to see a few things that might be different. And one of the things she's talking about is that instead of continued exponential growth of the human population, it actually tops out at 7.6 billion. This isn't truth. This is forecasting, backcasting, attempting to define and describe a vision. And why is that significant? Well, it's about what we can actually sustain in our biosphere. What can we do? And how do we start to recognize that we are living on a planet that isn't an endless food source for us? The scenario also goes on to talk about deglobalization. Well, we've been forced into that in one level through the pandemic, and also relocalization of food production and many other human activities. That there's also in this future casting a sense that there will be far more grassroots globalists, so people looking to really work in their local environments and shifting the agenda to globalization. Really the emphasis here being on bringing our focus into localizing our markets, working within the environment in which we are living and with the other players within our local environment, and to adjusting our needs and expectations accordingly. But as you can see, armies of different people starting to play that part, and we see them already. These are not new ideas, but this is about actually a lived experience. And also this idea of microgrid cooperatives, connecting with renewable power, in this case electricity, and really starting to see that as something that is much more present in our everyday world. And this idea of cooperative enterprises where they are employing more people than all the for-profit companies combined. Here, a fact that that's already the case. And yet we pay all of our attention to the very large organizations. And then this idea of shifting from a false way of thinking about growth and the metric of GDP, and thinking about it much more in terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which describe all aspects of a healthy ecosystem. So part of getting ourselves into a new way of thinking about our world and this courageous visioning means we have to be prepared to really stretch ourselves into the possibility of a new future. So before we go too much further with what that future might start to look like and some of the things that we maybe need to build into our own capability set, let's just have a think about those two words, courage and vision. And I always love going to the dictionary to just get a sense of how keywords are being described, because it's often very succinct, and it kind of gets us into the heart of the matter. So one aspect of the way in which the dictionary describes courage is as a single event, almost, that something facing us, we need to actually call on our depth of courage and bravery, and we need to step in and deal with that particular ordeal. And we may have faced those things in our lives. We may not. We may never have come to a situation where we really, really had to dig into our courage and our bravery. And then there's the more sustained aspect of bravery and courage, where it's in the face of something that's ongoing time and time again, and where we are called upon to access our courage over a period of time persistently. And in many ways, some of the activists that we see in the world today are having to live on both of these levels. They're having to have the courage to face and challenge individual situations and you know, bring the warrior spirit forward. But they're also having to deal with a deep felt sense of pain in the face of the destructive behaviors that we see across the planet. And that passion and energy is something we'll talk about a little bit more in a second. Vision, we all know what vision is. We all have a sense of it, both in the literal sight sense, but also here, as I've pulled it out from the dictionary, the ability to think about and plan the future with imagination or wisdom. And that can often feel like it's a challenge for us, because we may not see ourselves as having a big enough imagination, a big enough sense of the possibility. But in reality, that's not true. That's about actually pulling ourselves away from some of our habits and our constraints, the things that we allow to keep us stuck in a particular place, and actually accessing creative tools and inner resources that allow us to step into this space of imagination, inventiveness, innovation. And for sure, as young children, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way up to typically 7, we have played in that space of vision, imagination, possibility. But as we've gotten older, we've become conditioned by the world in which we live. And we have to disentangle ourselves from that in order to access vision. But I want to come back to the different aspects of courage, because I think this work by Melanie, a number of articles, this one was taken from Psychology Today. She very helpfully brings forward a number of definitions of courage. And if you again do some research in this space, you'd find 2 or 3 people who've attempted to give us different aspects of courage. I found these 6 to be particularly useful in thinking about some of our own individual behaviors, attitudes, capabilities, and perhaps some of the things that we might need to challenge ourselves on. So, of course, the dictionary definition picks us up on this first one, the feeling the fear, but choosing to act. And actually, courage and bravery, you know, so people will often say to each other, oh, that's very courageous. Well, courage is a relative thing. It depends to what degree we are feeling afraid and then still moving forward through a situation. And we all have different things that will trigger that. But how do we behave in that situation? Do we withdraw the flight aspect of our fight and flight instinctive responses, or do we step forward and take action even when fear is present? This thing about passion and following our heart is a key thing too, because unless we are connected with our heart, we won't be sustained in our courage. And it's that passion that actually spurs us on to find new discoveries, to find new ways of solving what seem to be intractable problems at times or opportunities. So engaging with our heart and our passion is a key part of being able to behave and act in a courageous way. As I said, from the dictionary definition, this perseverance is also very much an aspect of courage, being able to keep going, even though at times it appears like there's no progress being made. You know, changing our habits, our ways of working, our ways of thinking, our behaviors isn't a short-term thing. It can be, it should be, but we know doing that collectively takes time, and we have to be prepared to persevere. Connecting into our passion also then gives us the power to stand up for what is right, but it also demands of us that we think more deeply about what is right and what are our values and how do we show up in the world and how do we stand up in the world. To what extent are we armchair commentators, and to what extent are we actually taking action, which doesn't have to be standing on the front line of a really difficult demonstration, but it does need to be something where we are absolutely clear we are engaging in the conversation, in the change, and in the possibility of a new future. Some of that, as I said earlier, needs to come back into this space of expanding our horizons. We have to be prepared to let go of what we know now. And this can in itself, it can be pretty scary. Look at the year we've just had. and a lot of the letting go that has gone on, and yet still people are talking about getting back to normal. No, let's not get back to normal. Let's move forward to something new. We've already moved away from the shoreline to some degree. Let's continue that. Let's move forward. Let's find that courage to do it. And then recognizing that as we connect with our heart and we see that actually the change isn't moving as fast as we would like it to, we've got to be able to stay in that space, and however many tears, or inner or outer tears, that we recognize we can withstand suffering and we can move forward to something brighter. So courage in all its guises gives us a very powerful lens when it comes to thinking about how we might be an active player in the choice making and the new future that stands ahead of us, and to think about the role of organizations in that space. More on that to come. I wanted to just share with you this, this painting. It's a painting by a Russian painter called Nicholas Roerich. He's got a lot to you. Again, you'll find more on the internet if this inspires you. I picked this one. This is the title is in this case written in Italian, and it means the sword of courage. And you see here this figure shown as an angel, but a warrior really, with the sword facing downwards. A downward facing sword is a sword of courage, not a sword of aggression. And that sword of courage is what allows us to confront the obstacles and the hurdles that lie ahead on any pathway, that we are able to then achieve the goals that we set ourselves. And if you think about another metaphor that we are very familiar with, which is the sword of Excalibur, King Arthur's sword that was planted down into stone and could only be released when Arthur had reached sufficient level of consciousness and a sufficient level of good values within him in order to be able to take that sword forward, both in a leadership sense and in a personal sense. So that sort of courage is something we need in our organizations today. And there's some work that has been done and released not so very long ago by a group called Leaders on Purpose. And it's a study that was conducted over many years with around about 45 CEOs across the globe. And this multi-year study has brought out a number of different aspects of the challenge facing businesses and organizations, and thinking about the transition that is needed between the very traditional business logic, which is very oriented towards shareholder value and profit. And it's not to say, as I've said many times on these webinars, it's not about saying that that money and profit doesn't matter. The issue is to what purpose, to what end. And this report speaks a lot, and these 45 CEOs speak a lot about purpose-centered business logic. And again, this is not a new concept, it's not a new idea, but what we are starting to see is that this is gaining some traction, some momentum. Now, inevitably, when we start to look at some of these transitions, we can get into some cynical thinking. Of course, business is recognizing the zeitgeist and the need to shift and this transitional process. And of course, those larger organizations want to control the game, and they will be getting in there in order to do that. We can take that perspective, and to some degree that perspective will be true. But what we have to remember is that actually there are more people employed by non-global organizations than the larger global organizations employ. So we must not feel disempowered as individuals or as leaders when it comes to thinking about the new challenges and the new vision that we want to put in place. Now, as it happens, these 45 leaders are mainly from organizations you would recognize, and they are global. And they are committing themselves and their organizations to a more purpose-focused purpose-centered way of looking at organizational life. Now, these are a couple of, I'm going to show you just a couple of the summary charts that come from this report, and really just to indicate that this report has started to codify, started to kind of think about the sorts of things that are needed in order for purpose-based companies to really become a reality in our world, and not just something that is a kind of theoretical concept. And we get into some of these capabilities around our ability to really welcome complexity. We've got to get into a much deeper understanding of our biosphere and of the organization's biosphere and how those two come together. We've got to be much more open to a trial and error approach. You know, organizations pride themselves on control and efficiency and process and system, but we've got to be able to loosen that and start to learn so that we can keep making new changes and recognize the data and the feedback that we're getting from that. And we've also got to think more broadly about our stakeholders and moving into a space where we are designing metrics that are not just in support of one organization or one group of stakeholders, but is something that is much more established for a wider group. Some of the names that are were involved in this, company names and individual names: MasterCard, Danone, Philips, L'Oreal, the Rockefeller Foundation, Ketchum, Equity. These are all organizations that are substantial in size and yet are recognizing, at least to some degree, the need for change. This other model is quite interesting, and again, not perhaps as complex as the previous one, but useful nevertheless in terms of our a visual on this purpose-based organizational structure. Because if you look at the right-hand side of it, what we see are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And if we use that as our future focus, our future casting, the place at which we are going to make our contribution as an organization, the basis on which we set our vision, our mission, our values, our principles, then we start to cooperate with our biosphere on a completely different level. And so getting the boardroom and getting the decision makers to a place where the reason for a company's existence, the reason why an organization is participating or existing in the world should be defined by these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And if we can pick one or more of those to define our corporate purpose statement, then we'll be cooking on gas when it comes, not a great metaphor, when it comes to the way in which we shift this world and our relationship with it from an organizational and business point of view. So I said I'd be introducing some individual kind of thoughts from various speakers, some of whom or writers, some of whom you may or may not have come across. David Korten is another prolific activist, and he has brought to the fore a number of different aspects of change that we need to be working with. He's an author, a visionary. He's also a critic of corporate globalization because of the impacts that it has. And he also is very active in the space of new economy. And he also wrote at the beginning of this new decade and offered his thoughts on what is needed to write a new story for the for civilization, for humanity, and for the planet. And he offers 5 keys, as it were, to the new human future. And I thought it might just be helpful to share a little bit around those. So the first is the degree to which we truly acknowledge that a deep change is needed. As I said earlier, we can't cling to the pre-COVID status quo, because that will keep us it will keep us on a road to destruction. And we will have created a very dead earth which will regenerate, but we won't, because we'll have become extinct. And so our well-being as a humanity depends on the well-being of the whole, of all aspects. And if we start to recognize that that is a truth, and that that drives a need for change, then we can start to move on to the other steps, which includes thinking about, where have we got it wrong? Where have we failed? And we have made poor choices. Culturally, institutionally, technologically, from an infrastructure point of view, we've made poor choices. And we have to come back to a situation where we recognize our interdependence, but also where we recognize that core to nature, to the natural world, is a tendency to be able to self-organize in diverse communities that don't have to be dominated by one global ideology, other than at a very high level of consciousness. The third step, this unifying vision of possibility. We've got to be able to leave the shore and step into an alternative future, but it won't happen spontaneously. The new future, the new vision won't come about. We will just continue on the same pathway that we're on currently. So we have to create it together, and we have to be prepared to start to open up ideas, go into the fantastical, imagine what might be possible. We have to also then think about what is it that will actually support that vision? How do we turn those ideas, what might, at first glance almost seem like fantasies, how do we start to turn those into realities? And we have to move beyond the concentrated power in the hands of the few. I'm not going to spend ages talking about that, but we do know that I think the latest figure is that there are 26 billionaires who have a wealth equivalent to 50% of the poorest in the world. So if you take 50% of the world of humanity, from the poorest up to the middle point at 50%, 26 people have the equivalent apparent wealth and resource. But that also comes with power, and we have to get beyond that. We have to recognize the power of the 7.6 billion people that already live on Earth. And then together we have to be able to engage in collaborative transformation. And there are so many stories where this is already happening. We can take heart. We don't have to feel powerless or feel that it is too big for us. One way, when we're thinking about the skills or capabilities, the things that we might need to be thinking about in our leadership function, is how we might shift from what can feel very destabilizing in the VUCA world and turn that on its head in some ways, and start to get to a different way of thinking about that shift, how do we make that shift into a new level of capabilities. And this is some thinking that's put forward by a gentleman called Bob Johansen, who's an author, written a book called Full Spectrum Thinking, but also a fellow at the Institute for the Future. And he's offered this way of thinking about a transformation of VUCA. So moving from volatility to vision. So instead of allowing ourselves to just be, like we're being moved around in a washing machine and tumbled around with no apparent control, when we start to paint visions of our future, we get a certain level of not even control, but a relationship with that volatility. We start to work out how to work with it rather than feel like we have to defend ourselves against it. Many of us can be quite impacted by uncertainty, particularly those who have preferences for control or planning or needing to know. But if we shift that to understanding, if we move ourselves into the space where we're seeking to understand, we're doing our research, we're looking at what's going on, we're paying attention to what's happening in our world, and we're building our own picture and our own sense of truth, then we start to empower ourselves as leaders, and therefore also with the people that we come into contact with. Now, the pressure on leaders to have clarity and to be able to make decisions is long-standing, and in this world of complexity, that is tough to do. However, we can move to clarity. We just have to redefine what that clarity is. We have to redefine that clarity, not in absolutes, but in being able to establish some principles, some values, some destinational points, and then trust in the capabilities and the heart and the passion of the people in our organizations to want to find the ways that will enable the complexity to be navigated. And we also can turn what feels like ambiguity and you know, or wishy-washiness into a capability of agility, of being able to move from this situation to that situation and not be holding on to things too tightly or for too long. We hold on to principles and values, but we let go of systems and processes that are no longer serving us, and we move into a much more fluid space, and therefore we navigate ambiguity in a completely different way and with a completely different headspace. I'd mentioned futurists, and there are lots of different futurists out there, and again there's some of their work makes fascinating reading. Some of it will feel very fantastical, as I've said. Some of it will feel like it's just an extrapolation of our current situation. But the really good futurists actually start to take us into new possibilities. And one of the ways that they do this, and again, this is from the work by Bob Johansen, one of the ways they do this is to shift the linear thinking that we're often engaged in. So many of you may have been involved in or are involved in now that sort of strategic thinking that goes on in organizations. And quite often we get caught, often unconsciously, in the now. And so we find ourselves just thinking about the next step and then trying to forecast that into what the future looks like. What we're being encouraged to do by futurists is to recognize the now, but don't get caught up in it, because it's full of noise, it's full of complexity, it's full of stuff coming at us. So we know what the now is in all its guises, but we have to really launch ourselves into a vision of the future and then bring ourselves back to the now in order to work out coherent next steps. And in the number of organizations we deal with, that there are so many who do not get into long-term thinking. It seems to be such a challenging place for organizations because there's so much focus on the short term, on the here and now, on navigating what's right in front of us. So from an organizational point of view, we really, really have to step into our capability and capacities to get into this 10-year picture. What we then are able to tap into is an ability to have foresight, so to anticipate what might be coming, to then bring that into insight. In other words, what do we need to know? What are we missing? What needs to change? And then we can start to take the action. And from his work, I'm going to just take a quick example that might bring that to life a little bit more. And this was some work done by Procter & Gamble in the early days of biotech. And they were able to forecast that in the next 10 years, biotech would disrupt their hair care and detergent businesses. And that's foresight. So that's being able to see, okay, something is happening and it's going to have this type of impact. So the CEO of P&G looked around the C-suite, the various leaders, 12 of them at that time, and recognized that none of them, including himself, had enough background in biotech to be able to make good decisions. There's insight. That's where the insight comes from. And so they went into a reverse mentoring program where they worked with young PhD biotech scientists and learned about biotech over the course of the year. And at the end of the year, they then hired a new chief technology officer who was from one of those biotech specialists. And this person became the head of sustainability. And that's the action. Now, again, that's within a profit-focused model. And of course, that's, you know, we can have another conversation around that at some point. But essentially, what we can see is that by projecting ourselves out, we can start to find a way into a new future. So I'm going to stick with futurists and future thinking for a little bit, because again, I still believe this is something that we have yet to really grasp in the organizational space. Again, another futurist, Ari Wallach, who brings 3 other things for us to think about in this space. The first is to go beyond our thinking of a single generation. You know, we're all guilty at times, if not always, of being very self-centered. So we see the world inevitably through our own lens. And sometimes we can get caught with that. We get overly stuck in that space. And when we're overly stuck in that space, we don't actually see a bigger picture. We don't think in more multi-level ways. And in this case, we're being invited to think transgenerationally and think about the, in a sense, almost the infinity cycle of life, in that there were people before us and there will be people after us, God willing. And you know, if we get these choices right over the next few years and at most decades probably. And so when we step into transgenerational thinking, we expand how we think about problems, and we also expand how we expand our own role in solving them. So we don't just live in the here and now and, you know, pull up the drawbridge, I'm all right, Jack. And even though most of us would think we've got a good heart and we don't think that way, our actions will sometimes belie that, or perhaps often belie that. So when we look at our organizations, we've got to think about, to what degree are there conversations going on that are thinking about the problems of our world and thinking about those in a bigger context, not just in the lifetime of the people at the top of the organization. So we've got to get beyond ourselves. We're also invited to move into a multi form view of the future. So not just a single future, but talk about futures, multiple. And by going into different scenarios, and Shell were famous for this. I remember when I was doing my MBA many years ago, Shell was held up as one of the best organizations for scenario planning as part of their strategic thinking. And again, many organizations will have adopted that. But getting into scenario planning and being able to position that not just from a profit-making perspective, but from this transgenerational biosphere perspective, we then start to hypothesize around different scenarios. And that in itself gives us insights into new kinds of solutions. So we have to think bigger. We have to think more expansively, which doesn't mean to say our actions all have to be global. They can be very local, but we have to separate ourselves from any constraints in our thinking. And then telos thinking, telos from the word Greek. And here we're being invited to think about, so what's the purpose? What's the ultimate aim of our thinking when we're getting into those actions, when we're getting into the next steps, and when we're defining our purpose? What is the ultimate aim? Who are we serving? What's the goal here? Is it about me, myself, I, expressed at an organizational level? Is it about our survival? Is it about some level of collective thriving? And if the ultimate purpose can be defined in terms of thrivability and in terms of true sustainability, not in the more cynical expression of that, but in a genuinely interconnected sense, then we start to define completely different futures for ourselves. So let's just take a look at some of the things that are going on in the business world and the organizational world. And today, kind of interestingly and perhaps synchronistically, is World Earth Day. This particular webinar was due to take place in January, and we needed to move it, and we moved it to today. And it seems completely perfect to me that that is the case. It's World Earth Day, and so we're, going to be reminded throughout the day across the internet of all those reasons why we should be thinking more broadly. So I love that. I love that synchronicity. But one of the things that is out there on the internet today that I thought was just worth bringing in for us in our conversation is some work that's being done by Patagonia. Now, Patagonia is one of our organizations that we often refer to in the sort of conscious leadership, conscious business space, because they are very much committed to the bigger picture, to the biosphere, to the connecting with the planet, and their whole business model is based on that. And they've recently launched a campaign to support community-owned energy across Europe. Now, you know, Patagonia is one of those organizations I would not get cynical about. And, you know, personally, I don't have a cynical response to their actions, because it flows through every fabric, every part of their business model. And with this campaign, what they're really bringing forward, which is working with a whole number of local communities, they bring forward a core sense of that ultimate aim, that telos, if you will, which is that they say they're in business to save our home planet. So they've really pinned their core purpose out there in the context of the planet. And when we think about some of the examples that are already present in this community-owned energy, there's Brixton Energy in London, which is a local housing estate, a cooperative amongst residents for solar power, which is on the roofs of the houses, community-owned, resident-owned, nothing to do with the government in that case. There's an example of a wind farm in Denmark, which is co-owned between the city of Copenhagen and local residents. And Germany, where half of all renewable energy, 50% of all renewable energy, is community owned. So, you know what, we're not starting from a standing start at this point. So for anyone who may be feeling, oh, this is huge, you know, what do I do? It's beyond me. There is work already going on. We can find our way into these new solutions. But we also know that there's an awful lot of inertia in the business world and in the organizational world, and you know, more and more pressure is needing to be applied into the CEOs and into the organizations and into shareholders and other key stakeholders. But it is down to business, and we've said on other webinars that fundamentally the role of organizations in our world is much greater than we have previously considered. It's much greater. And actually, quite a lot of the change that needs to come forward will be down to business, the for-profit businesses, because they can make or break the way in which our world goes forward. And there are some glimmers, there are some things that we can hold on to and take courage and comfort from. Firstly, most of the surveys that are done with CEOs at the moment, certainly we've referred to the Edelman Trust survey in the past, but it's appearing in many different surveys. There's a recognition that CEOs have to be prepared to answer questions on just about any aspect of society. They have to be seen to be CEOs of society, not just of their individual organization. They have to be engaged in that space. There's a growing demand for that. One example, we know that Satya Nadella is already quite an aware and conscious leader, but 1/6 of his cash bonus is based on the achievement of diversity goals. Again, we can take a cynical view of that. It's already a huge amount of money. You know, his reward at $10.8 million. You know, you have to ask the question, who really needs that sort of money? However, the glimmer of hope within that is at least the motivation is being aligned to some goals that are actually for the better of humanity. In this case, Marriott, another example, of the CEO who announced that he would be foregoing his salary and that the executive team will be taking a pay cut. Okay, it's small beer in the scheme of all the other rewards they will be getting. Absolutely take that, but it's a symbol, it's a step. and more recently, a McKinsey survey, and this is the grassroots shift that we need to be paying attention to. Found that 39% of people said that who responded to the survey said that they had turned down a job because of the organization's perceived lack of inclusion. And we know at this point in time that equality, diversity, inclusion is very much on the agenda of organizations. Can it become a fundamental part of organizational life as opposed to a sticking plaster or a cynical nod? Well, that's in the hands of many of you in terms of what you campaign for, how you lead, and what you get behind. We've seen evidence of organizations break the rules and experiment. Again, there are many, many examples. So we can take courage and heart from those, and we can get off the back of them. Again, yes, recognizing it's still often within a kind of more traditional capitalist model, but we need to build on the examples that come through. Pret a Manger have a recruitment rule book where they recruit for attitudes and behaviors in order to build their high energy service culture. They're looking for a mindset. They're not looking for particular skill sets. They recognize they can train people. It's not rocket science, but they are absolutely fixed about the importance of it and have been criticized for it, but it has led to them building a very successful organization. H&M have been saying a lot more recently about their view of the future of fashion, where they themselves are launching circular fashion. In other words, they recognize that they've been contributing heavily to the destruction of the planet, and what they're seeking to do is, through the power of their brand and their retail and consumer base, to actually invite people to recycle their clothes, and they then will make new clothes from the recycled clothes. So in other words, reusing fabrics and so on. So they're really testing their own boundaries around how to do this and what that looks like, and recognizing that digital is going to drive their business in a very different way. And then we can tap into some of the entrepreneurial thinking that is around in abundance. And again, that can be driven towards profit. But in this case, a fintech company had adopted a flat management structure, which is called Holacracy. We've touched on it before. And this is about organizing teams. But what they recognized, and this is an example of agility, they recognized that they were getting feedback. It wasn't really working. People didn't like it. So they changed. They tried and they changed. And that's, again, part of this new world that we've got to get into in futurist thinking. And we all associate, creative thinking, new thinking, breaking the rules with Steve Jobs. And he amongst many failures of his own, but one of his facets was scrutinizing every detail of the work environment. And he went out to Japan and saw Japanese companies providing uniforms for all of their employees. Tried to introduce that into Apple, got knocked back. That wasn't something that was acceptable. But it was just an example of seeing something somewhere and thinking about, how can I apply it? How can I bring that forward? So we're getting into the final couple of minutes here, and I just wanted to offer two more things, really. One is that we've got to come back to this principle of courage and vision, and we will be able to find many examples why we shouldn't step into that space. And here's a pretty high profile one. Emmanuel Faber was the CEO until very recently of Danone. Danone is an incredible organization. It is an organization that since 1972 has been dedicated to the mission that growth should no longer be an end in itself, but rather a tool used to serve the quality of life without ever being detrimental to it. And this was brought in by its former CEO, Antoine Riboud. But what Emmanuel Faber has consequently done on the back of that legacy has brought Danone to become an entreprise à mission, which is a precursor to the full B Corp status that it's also been pursuing, and it's a status for purpose-led businesses that became law in France in 2019, and he's enshrined the company's mission in law. Now, performance hasn't been great over the last year for Danone, and for various reasons, Faber was ousted from his position. And we could take that as a reason not to go forward and not to be courageous. Or we can recognize that each of us lays down certain building blocks in change. And our mission may be a temporary, a moment in time. And we need to pursue that mission regardless of the consequences to us personally, because that is the building block in this transgenerational thinking, as opposed to being focused on personal survival and saying what other people want you to say or need to hear. So he's left a legacy that builds on the original legacy, and it will be picked up by the next CEO, regardless of the pressure from a very small number of shareholders who were able to oust him. And my final thought for you as we close up here today is this extract from, I make no apologies for it, it's from a spiritual book, but it reads to me like a poem, and I think it's actually a great way to remind ourselves and inspire ourselves as to what we have to be doing at this time in human history. Can the tree stand firm? Yes, yes, yes. If the roots are deeply buried and unseen beneath the ground. I told you of beauty. I told you of love. I told you of action. I told you of devotion. I told you of readiness and compassion. I have opened the window for you, and I've shown you the battle. I've explained the meaning of courage. And finally, I've summoned you to the great service. We all have acts of service ahead of us. Please find the courage and the vision to step into those. It doesn't have to be global. In fact, it needs to be local. I wish you well with that. I hope you've found some inspiration from our sharing today, and look forward to welcoming you to our next webinar in due course. Have a great day.